alone, no chaperone can get our number. The world's in slumber, let's misbehave. There's something wild about you, child, that's so contagious. Let's be outrageous, let's
I
misbehave.
hope you all enjoyed the film. It's one of my favorites, and I've watched it a million times, and it never gets old. Um, there's often a discussion when we talk about screwball comedy of whether or not it can be made today in the same spirit of films from the 1930s. And while I think that filmmakers can certainly infuse screwball elements into modern films, in my opinion, the genre is very much tied to a specific place and time in our history. The genre is very American and it's born out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And in that vein, the reason why I bring that up is because Nothing Sacred very much captures the mood of the era. Now, this was released in 1937. So we're several years on from the start of the Great Depression. There's growing unrest all around the world, and specifically also in Europe. And I think the film very much matches the overall tone that Americans were sort of feeling, the sentiment the Americans had at the time. It's a very cynical film, and it's unabashedly so. Um, Now, screwball comedy is also a genre that foregrounds performance, and characters often take on other identities. They put on acts. They're not who they say they are. And Nothing Sacred is that to an extreme. Everyone in the film is a phony, and I believe Hazel Flagg actually says we're fakers. They're phonies in some different shape or form. And I think that goes back to the underlying tonal cynicism of the film. Everyone's trying to sort of have put one over on somebody else, get ahead. And, that begins with Hazel Flagg. She just wants to have an escape from her humdrum life in Warsaw, Vermont. And ultimately, she lands herself in a situation that's sort of too big for her. And she realizes that the big city is not all that she thinks that it is, and everyone there is just as sort of shady and sinister as the next person. And I think the film very much celebrates that cynicism in a way that you don't necessarily see in a lot of 1930s uh, films. It's very biting. It has an edge to it, and I love it for that reason. Um, This film, I mentioned Carole Lombard in my introduction and how this was very much a transitional sort of film for her. It was her next step, if you will, in the evolution of her career, going from studio contract player to freelancer. And I think this film is very much a display of a different Carole Lombard that we see in her earlier comedies. She's at her most confident and her most self-assured, and we hadn't really seen that quite up to that point. There's an effortlessness to her performance, and she's just absolutely radiant. My favorite shot of Lombard in any film is the close-up of her face when she's talking to Fredric March just outside of her doctor's house. It's this beautiful close-up, and she's almost, glowing that she's so beautiful. Her blonde hair's sort of shimmering in the light, and Wellman and his cinematographer, W. Howard Green, capture her beautifully. And this is Lombard's only feature-length film that was shot in color. She made several Technicolor shorts with Max Sennett, and I think just the color just emphasizes that beauty. Um, Now, Lombard, I think in this film in particular, she's very malleable and unrestrained in terms of her performance and her physicality, and we hadn't really seen that from her since her days with Max Sennett. She was working for Max Sennett, I should add, from 1927 to 1929, and that was sort of her testing ground, her formative years, where she really learned how to be a comedian. She learned how to use her body, what worked, what didn't work, and it was really invaluable training. And Lombard was very much in a league of her own in terms of physical comedy. Um, Other actresses, of course, perform physical comedy here and there, but it was a consistent trait in Lombard's performances throughout her career. And I think a lot of that has to do with just her ease and her familiarity with her own body. Um, and Lombard in this film, and I think in Screwball generally, she really represents the ideal screwball heroine. She was all of those qualities that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, and she was also breathtakingly beautiful and glamorous when it called for it. And I think that juxtaposition is the screwball heroine's essence. On paper, a lot of her screwball characters can come across as a bit grating. I think Hazel Flagg has a little bit of those qualities. Certainly Irene Bullock does in My Man Godfrey. But Lombard was just so naturally endearing and charismatic that you can't help but fall in love with her. And I think this film really showcases her at her best. Um, Now, speaking of physical comedy, this film really pushed the boundaries, I think, in terms of what was acceptable at the time. Now, Bosley Crowther, who was the New York Times film critic, he jokingly in his review declared that nothing sacred led to, and I quote, the demise of female fragility in Hollywood cinema. And his review was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but he was getting at the fact that Hazel Flagg behaves quite differently than the female characters that were typically seen up until that point. And she's put on a relatively even playing field with Wally, and that's aptly demonstrated in their big fight scene. She's able to get a punch in. She literally punches him in the jaw. She's thrown around almost like a rag doll. He really doesn't hold back. And there's only really been a fairly recent reappraisal of female physicality on the screen, and I'm talking in terms of film studies scholarship. And I kid you not, when I was writing my dissertation, I came across several scholars' work, and I won't mention them by name, but they essentially made the argument that physical comedy was a male domain, and they'd rightly celebrate comics like Chaplin, Keaton, Lloyd, but they treat films like Bringing Up Baby or Nothing Sacred, for example, as aberrations. And I remember when I was writing my dissertation and when I was adapting it into my book, I was just so frustrated because, I was writing so much about screwball comedy and, I was studying films like Nothing Sacred. I knew that that narrative was so far from the truth. And recently, there's been an effort by scholars to sort of correct the record in terms of the role that actresses played in advancing physical comedy on the screen. For example, scholar Linda Mizjewski, she wrote that historically, women were meant to be seen as either pretty or funny, but not both. However, as she and I and countless others now have pointed out, that actually isn't the case. Actresses like Carole Lombard and some of her successors, like Lucille Ball, who was a mentee of Carole Lombard's, and Carol Burnett and others, they remind us that women have always been physical comedians and that they've been visible in this space since the birth of cinema. And so I think when we watch a film like this, you realize just how powerful Lombard's performance is, and that Selznick was giving her a space to sort of act out and be loud, be visible, and sort of her performance really is sort of like a declaration of like, I'm here. And um, that's one of the reasons why I love this film so much. Now, I don't want to miss out on talking about William Wellman because for me, he is a fascinating director. His films are so dynamic and alive, and he was able to move through a variety of genres. And I think that definitely speaks to his versatility. And I think that dynamic sensibility and really comes from his background, perhaps as a pilot and an aviation enthusiast. He brings that energy to his work. I think this film coincides with Lombard's um, complex star persona. She had very much both masculine and feminine sides to her star persona. Now, around the time of this film's release, there was an article published in Photoplay called How I Live by a Man's Code. And if you read it, it's a bit dated by our standards. It very much reaffirms the binary gender stereotypes. But it's a revealing glimpse, I think, into how she was perceived at the time. Lombard, in this article, she touts her quote unquote masculine sensibilities. For example, she was very good at business, which I mentioned in my introduction. She was very practical. She had a sort of a very good head on her shoulders. But at the same time, she admitted that she still retained her inherent femininity. She was into beauty and glamour. And I think in that way, Lombard was situated as a contemporary actress. She was able to balance both of these sides. And I think that was, as I alluded to in my introduction, essential to the business of Hollywood stardom. But I think that also speaks to Hazel Flagg as a character and Lombard's performance specifically, in that Lombard was such a beautiful woman. She, as I mentioned, there are some shots in this film that are just gorgeous, but she wasn't afraid to look unglamorous if the role called for it, and you see that in this film. Half the time she's in a robe with wet hair, or she's completely covered up with a hot ice pack on her head. And for Lombard, that really didn't matter. She obviously was very much aware of how she was perceived by the public, but she wasn't necessarily vain. She was okay with looking um, less than glamorous, as I said, if the part called for it. And I think one of the many reasons why I love this film is that she really gave it her all. And that comes across in her performance. It feels very authentic. Um, and finally, if we want to talk about the legacy and relevance of Nothing Sacred today, I mean, in terms of Carole Lombard, I think it very much cemented her status as the queen of screwball comedy. She's and a physical one at that. Um, Her performance is very sincere and honest um, and just audacious. And I think that just is why she was really in a league of her own. Now, in terms of the film's continued relevance, I think it speaks to the idea that our culture makes people famous for the dumbest of reasons. Hazel just wanted a trip to New York to escape her life, and she became this celebrity really for no other reason than, because the press could get a good story out of her suffering. And when they realize, of course, that she's not actually dying, then they kind of, drop her and they're not interested anymore. And one of my favorite scenes that showcases that actually comes when she's in her hotel room, and all the citizens of New York and the dignitaries and whatnot, they're gathered outside of her hotel room, and they're sort of chastising her, like, how dare you say you're not sick? Why aren't you dying? You're sort of behaving immorally. And I think that just speaks to sort of the hypocrisy of everyone in the film. All of the characters are sort of, as I said before, putting on an act. And also it speaks to, I think, the media's culpability in elevating figures like Hazel Flagg to these godlike proportions. In this case, the stakes are relatively low, but in our culture today, that can have dire consequences. And so I think, this film is 88 years old, but it's just as fresh as it was when it was released back in 1937. And I think we can learn a lot from Nothing Sacred.
In slumber, let's misbehave. There's something wild about you, child, that's so contagious. Let's be outrageous, let's misbehave. When Adam won Eve's hand, he wouldn't stand for teasing. He didn't care about those apples out of season. They say the spring means just one thing to little lovebirds. We're not above birds,